members and for posterity, put it up on the wall to throw darts at it, whatever works. Of course, you heard the latest news, and that was that bee swarm delayed the Dodgers Diamondbacks baseball game in Phoenix. It landed on one of the nets. And our latest hero among the beekeeping world is this fellow. That is Matt Hilton. He left his son's baseball game to go capture the swarm. He used a vac device to capture it. Had to use a lift to get up to it. And that happens, every year or so, relative to our honeybees. We have had a terrific swarming year up here because we had very mild November. We had some kind of cooler December, but then January and February were milder again, and March was very mild. We had swarms in March, which is not normal for here. We might, but April and now into May is usually our swarming time. More news, the U.S. Farm Bill, the details have been released. This is from the federal government, whether we will get a new farm bill. There's what's one of the toughest of the bills for Congress to try to pass, and they have delayed even introducing the new one. So we're sort of on an extended farm bill right now. This relates because bees are, for their importance at least, our livestock, and we need that protections and the incentives and the programs that come from the farm bill to help keep our overall bee populations healthy. Coming up soon is Mother's Day. So from Honeyville in Colorado, they have 4 mini jars of their honey, a sunflower honey jam spreader, lip gloss, beehive-shaped container, bee sweet whipped body butter, soapy goat milk, bar soap, 2 chocolate toffee bars, and a colorful spring-themed kitchen towel, all for $60. Well, what we'll be talking about tonight will be perhaps in anticipation that Mother's Day will come again next year. What we could do to try to have a product for such as a big mother's basket like this year probably isn't going to work in the next couple of weeks before Mother's Day. All right, well, start with our product that we talk about, honey. Honey is one of our earliest sweeteners. It was important along with ripened fruits and some other types of syrups that could be made from those fruits, etc. But it was one of our earliest of our sweeteners. It's mentioned in all the early books that helped establish the various religions, the Bible, the Quran, etc. Individuals originally were robbers. They harvested bees where they were found. They were found in trees. They were in caves. Then eventually we learned a little bit about bees, and we learned that we could bring them closer to where we could then help protect them and keep them in structures. So I did a Revolutionary War story for public broadcasting back in Maryland days. And we had a farmer at the late 1700s, so here is shown with his son. They had 4 stokes or 4 colonies of bees, 2 in log gums and 2 in the straw skeps. And that was certainly common. This would have been a prosperous farmer to be able to maintain 4. He would harvest 2. The other 2 would swarm and hopefully capture the swarms, or they would put the boxes out and swarms would inhabit them. And get back to 4 or 5 to be able to harvest at the end of a season, as we were doing. So what is it? And there's many different definitions. The one that we kind of go with is a sweet viscid fluid produced by the bees from the nectar collected from flowers and stored in the nest or hives as food. Okay. A second one is the nectar of flowers, which is not a very good, accurate definition. Part of our something sweet, delicious, or delightful, another definition of honey, and then other terms, of course, used in flattery and endearing terms. Part of the problem is we don't have a national definition of honey, and only some of the states actually have a definition of what honey is. So there is a bit of a leeway in terms of of what we might say or what we might call that as honey. But basically, it's a sugary plant secretion, which is converted by insects into simple sugars with a lowered moisture content. Bees collect sugar, and in most cases, we're talking about a flower nectar, but there are some others. I've got an illustration in a second here. And then what they do is by the addition of an enzyme, the enzyme invertase or sucrase, that enzyme chemically changes all of the different sugars that are in nectar into the two simple sugars. The two simple sugars are the 6 carbon sugars, glucose and fructose. And the ratio of glucose and fructose varies a bit among different honeys. So it's never, it's not ever a 1-to-1. Often it's a fairly close, a mixture of the two. Of those two sugars. So it's both a chemical action, converting those sugars that are present, and then there's a physical action where they're going to make it very viscous. They're going to concentrate it through evaporation of water in this product that we're going to call honey. Okay. Mentioned our dirty little secret is that our honey is from nectar, but in addition, there can be some other sources. Some which would still are still qualified, would fit with some definitions of honey at least, and some that don't. Okay, so the people that make the high fructose corn syrup would like to call that a sugar. Commercial beekeepers use that product, a lot of it, to feed their bees, and the bees will convert that into a corn syrup honey for storage and for their own use as well. There are some places besides just a nectar. Blueberry is a good example where the plant secretes this sugary fluid, but not at a flower, but at an extra floral nectary. The secretion is very similar. The material is very similar to what nectar is, or if not the same. It's just it's not secreted at the flower. It's secreted in other parts. Cotton is another example. There are several where plants will secrete this sugary solution from other places. Some parts of the world, they have a forest or a tree honey. This comes from not from a nectar, but it comes from a plant, insect that sticks its mouth parts into the plant, extracts the fluid, then concentrates the fluid so it can get from that fluid the things it needs in its existence. And so the sugar that is in that plant fluid is a toxin, or can be a toxin. So they have special stomachs that they can actually shunt this around, concentrate it, and then they excrete it because they have to get the other things out of that sugar for their own dietary needs. This we call honeydew honey, as I indicate, forest honey. It can come from a variety of different sources. So it's still a plant fluid, a plant sugar that's just been passed through an insect first before then the bees come and pick it up. There are a few other things besides honeybees that do make a honey. The original bee of the Americas before the colonialists brought it initially to North America, eventually to Central and South America as well, was a honey from a stingless bee, not a single species, a whole range of different species. And this stingless bee, due to movement of the continents in the original original what our planet looked like, is they're also found in Africa and in Asia, but they were most exploited and used by man by the early civilizations here in the Americas. they got into southern part of California, but not as far north as you are or we are here in Oregon. Bumblebees will make also honey. Again, these it can be collected. Very similar process. There is an ant that individual ants use their body as a reservoir, and so the fluid, the sticky fluid, is concentrated to be held in the crop of the ants, and these ants are sort of use their mouth parts to hang from a top of a cavity. And when the carbohydrate, the sugar is needed, others will go up and communicate with that ant, and it will regurgitate. So in that case, it's the organism itself, the ant, that's actually holding the reservoir. There is a wasp that most wasps are meat eaters, and that's kind of the distinction between a wasp and a bee. But there is one that also one or more, a couple of different species that also store a sweet, sugary material in their nest. So there's a honey wasp as well. And of course, in the commercial world, there are products that might be called honey, sometimes different spellings or whatever, that are really just another source of plant sugars that may or may not have been concentrated. So what we as beekeepers would say would be adulterated plant sugars that are labeled as honey, or artificial honeys, whatever might be the case. And of course, in the real world these days, there are ways to actually shortchange the work the bees do of processing that sugary solution from flowers into product honey. So there are ways to do that with machines, so that you can actually take, as the bees collect the nectar, take it then from a nest and make it into a honey without the bees going through that process of doing so. So there are some alternatives, of course. So here's a bee that's on leaf material, and you can see its mouth parts extended, and this sticky material is the honeydew. So this is material that's gone through typically aphids, but they're scale insects. There's a whole bunch of these. Another type of insect that uses that as its food, but the sugar becomes a toxin, and so they're excreting the extra sugar so they can get from that plant fluid what they need for their living. Okay. The honeydew was the reason why we had the 2014 bee kill. These are bumblebees in a parking lot. Bumblebees that were foraging on trees that were shading the parking lot. And on those same trees, there were these plant-sucking insects. And the honeydew, as they excreted, would fall onto windshields of cars parked. And when you get honey, this sticky material on your windshield, you turn on your wipers and it just smears it right across the windshield. Well, to help avoid that happening, a pesticide company sprayed the trees. These were the lime tree or linden tree. Sprayed the trees early in the morning, and as a way to eliminate the plant-sucking insects. But the trees were in full bloom at the time of spraying, and they also killed bumblebees. They killed an estimated 50,000 plus, perhaps double that, in this one spraying event by itself. Happened to be that just adjacent to this, this is one of the big box stores in the parking lot, happened to be just adjacent to it a field of clover. And we grow clover about 3 years here, and the mat of clover in those fields becomes just an excellent place for voles to form their tunnels and their nests. And those happen to make very good habitat for bumblebees as a nesting habitat in among that clover. And so it just by happenstance, this place happened to be next to a field that had been in clover for 3 years. So there were just a tremendous number of bumblebees, more than one species, but primarily one species, that were killed. This then kicked off quite a different response from the public. The trees were eventually tented, would you believe, tented something like 55 trees in a shading parking lot to try to keep further kill away from happening. But it was primarily done initially with the kill. And this was a neonicotinoid that was used, one of those that was labeled for spraying for these plant-sucking insects. So the Wilsonville bumblebee kill was all related to honeydew as a factor. There were relatively few honeybees that were killed. They were mostly these bumblebees, leading to a lot of numbers of changes, and this is in how we perceive pollinating insects, and eventually leading to federal government doing some measures to help protect pollinating insects, all related to honeydew, trying to reduce honeydew falling onto car windshields from the plant-sucking insects. The bumblebees were there to collect the nectar, not to collect the honeydew. Occasionally, you'll see a very unique or unusual looking honey in cells. In this case, a very green looking fluid. We never could determine, this was in Oregon, we never could determine what the source of this fluid, the sugary fluid that the bees were collecting, and then in the process of ripening into honey, this very green color. But we've had instances of adjacent to M&M, the chocolate candy, the covering that goes over the chocolate with a kaleidoscope of the colors of the M&Ms. And we've had instances where processing of cherries into the maraschino cherries, that fluid. And if you ever look behind the IHOPs and places, and breakfast syrup places, breakfast pancake places, you'll see lots of bees coming and going and collecting all those sweet syrups. So bees will indeed collect some of these others, and you might see one of these very unique or unusual colored nectar processing into honey in your bee colonies at that time. So why is it different from any of these other syrups, sugar syrups? The major feature is the first two, that these are sugar that has been processed so that they are now in the simplest form of sugars, meaning honeybees and other organisms, including ourselves, do not require a digestion. The sugars, as they enter our digestive tract, are immediately then assimilated, are immediately taken out of the digestive tract and do not need to be further digested. Whereas if you eat sugar from cane or sugar from beets or maple syrup or molasses, brown sugar, whatever, our body is going to use essentially the same type of enzyme, and that enzyme is going to break it down into these simple sugars, the glucose, fructose. Well, in honey, that's already been done. It's already been done by the honeybee adding the enzyme into to its changing of the nectar into honey. Second is a concentrated syrup, so you get more bang for your buck. You have often a mixture of not only glucose, but the more sweeter to our taste, fructose sugar in the final product. And so if you are using honey in preparations of foods, or using it directly, or as the rest of the world uses honey to make the medicine go down, then what you have is a concentrated form of it, and you do not have to use as much to get that hit, that sweetening power, because it's already concentrated. Most of the moisture has been taken out by the bees themselves in the processing of the nectar into the honey. Additionally, another factor that is different about this syrup is that it's not going to spoil. The bees, in converting and changing the nectar to honey, leave in that hydrogen peroxide, which is the H2O2 there in that third line, and also add an acid in it as well called gluconic acid. which an oxidase system then in the product will convert as a conversion of the glucose into this acid, and with it the hydrogen peroxide, the water component that is produced in the conversion, and thus as a result it is a self-preservative. Low level, so that not as concentrated as if you took hydrogen peroxide for some injury in your mouth, but still at a level sufficiently adequate that it is able then to be protected, so that if microorganisms get into the honey by one means or another, between the high viscosity, that is low moisture, and this production of the glucose oxidase system, that type of microorganism doesn't have a chance to grow and reproduce. So essentially we say honey will last forever. I was just reading in the Middle East, they have found some honey recently in some excavations that were used for in burials of some of the nobility, the more important people or in a community, and they were debating should they try it and see if the honey was okay still to use as a product, depending on how it was stored. Of course, they have found it to be perfectly edible, maybe darker with age, but still perfectly edible after literally thousands of years in that form. Okay, and finally, the other, although minor, important component is that nectar, or that liquid that is collected, whether it's the honeydew or the extrafloral nectar, has more than just refined cane or beet sugar. So the sugar that we buy, unless you are sucking on a piece of cane, or you are near where beets are grown for sugar, and using those beets in your kitchen or in your diet, the components in that fluid have a number of other things that are in the plant enzymes, other minerals, for example, vitamins, a lot of other things as well, cholesterol. And in the processing by bees from nectar to honey, that is not modified. It follows right on through. So some honeys are very flavorful, have a larger percentage of these components. Some have fewer, but all honeys from those plant sources will have, in addition to just being a sugar, highly concentrated sugar, will have these additional components. Our sugars are highly refined, that we would eat, as table sugar, any of the other forms of sugars that we might use in our diet. Okay, so what is it? It's a more than a simple sugar solution. It's giving us some other things that were also in the plant, and it's a very highly concentrated solution that through time, with storage, maintains its identity and is not degraded by processes such as microbes or addition of other materials into it. With the high viscosity, they just are not able to multiply. So it is different, certainly. All right. A little bit on now to how it's made, and we'll focus on this probably the rest here. Bees collect the sugar, nectar usually, but also sources. They convert it into honey, storing it into the beeswax cells. And then initially we became robbers of that as a source of dietary sweetener. Now we harvest that and a little bit more the system where we're not destroying the structure, the comb structure. We can harvest it in such a way, our extracted honey, the comb structure, the storage implement, the honey beeswax comb is maintained. Okay, and then by our simple processes of encouraging bees to store surplus, manipulating colonies so that they are bigger, so that they have an opportunity to take advantage of sources and store more of it. And then by use of the beehive, being able to harvest that in such a way that we're not damaging it from the way that the bees have stored it, although we might be modifying it by removing it from the beeswax comb. Honeys are distinct to the source, the sugar, the plant sugar, are unique to that. So one honey, one season's honey, honey collected from bees that might be separated in a different colony in the same apiary. They can all be different, sometimes not significantly so, not greatly so in many cases, but in other cases, just very different as the bees go through the season and then are collecting that nectar from different floral sources, or the honeydew, or the extra floral nectar sugars from different sources. They all will be different. So basically it's flower to hive. And that's where, of course, our bees are going to come into the process in terms of changing that, what they're collecting mainly in the flower, into what they're storing then in their beehive. The foraging bees, so bees in their adult lifetime pass through 4 caste phases or sequence of duties, and the last part of their life they are the foragers. So the foraging bees, these older of the adult workers, they go to flowers. They collect the fluid into a special honey stomach, which is a crop that is reversible. So the material that can go in that then can be returned by muscular action back out to the mouth part. And then they return home with that. So they're not going out foraging for themselves individually, eating in the field. They're actually collecting, bringing the resource back. And then in the hive, as shown in the right, they will then pass it to a hive bee. These are bees that we would recognize in their middle age. So these are bees that have passed the age where they act as nurse age bees or nursing bees to feed the young, or what we are middle age bees. These are bees that have 2 major functions in colonies: the food processing, this gathering of the honey from the forager, processing it into honey, and also then the preparation of the storage structures, the beeswax comb. Those are the kind of the 2 major functions, along with lots of others, but the 2 major functions of those middle-aged bees after they've gone through a period of time. Most of them, adult worker bees, pass through the stage of nursing, providing a brood food for the larvae of their colony that need to be fed in the cells themselves. The processing of the nectar is a 2-step process, kind of in a continuum. Once the hive bee has received a partial stomach load from the forager, there is an active and a passive evaporation process. In the active process, the worker bee, the hive bee, produces a bubble from her crop contents, reverses the muscles, brings that fluid back up to her mouth parts, and then continues doing this for a period of time. How much time varies with a number of different conditions. And then they will put those droplets of that liquid in their beeswax comb, in such a way that there is the hive environment. Hives are very humid. They are very dark, of course, warm places. And so that nectar, then moisture is removed from the droplets of nectar that they're painting in cells. They eventually consolidate all of those nectar cells into the comb, so they have you know, the advantage of storing a very concentrated fluid in a very efficient manner by concentrating the fluid and then having to use less storage space with the concentrated honey as it goes through this ripening process. So when we look in our colonies, we're going to see often, most times of the year, this ripening process. Upper left, you can see on a frame some capped cells, and below it some cells that are not yet capped, indicating that the honey has not been fully processed. Once it has been processed, at least to the degree that they're accepting it, they will put this wax covering or capping over the honey cells. The ripening process is honey that is in the open cells that we see. A close-up of that to the bottom left, where you can see some cells that are being partially capped, a couple cells fully capped, but others that the capping hasn't completely been completed. And then other cells below that are in a process of ripening of the conversion from the nectar to the honey. And then a photo through that, so you can see that in our frame, this will be an uneven process. Not all the cells necessarily will be involved at all times of the year, and it'll depend very greatly in terms of, you know, how much space is needed. Basically, they need more space for the ripening honey, but then when it is fully ripened, they then protect it so that nothing will get into it by that wax covering or capping over the cell. So that is basically that process. So what we wait for in terms of our harvest is combs, frames that are fully or pretty much fully capped over. We might use as left a full depth frame, as you see here. Virtually all the cells there are capped, or a lighter honey source with a lighter capping on top right. And on bottom right, we see actually there are a couple different kinds of honey. As you can see, there's like a band honey at the top, and then there's a band, like a semicircular band. And then in the center, where they had been rearing brood, they've not allowed the queen to return, and that is all liquid that is in a process of being ripened. So what we're going to do in terms of our management is we're going to try to guide our colonies so that they are at a point where they can take advantage of this nectar that's coming in and store more than they need. So just as our ancestors, we're basically robbing from the bees, but with our movable comb hive, we're robbing in a more refined way. So and taking, hopefully only taking the surplus, what they're not going to need for the season. So most of our beekeeping basically is between the first day of spring and the first day of autumn. That's most of our beekeeping. There's a couple of other seasons, of course. The bee season actually starts after the winter solstice, near the end of December. Eventually, they're able to tell day length, and that then will kick off the queen and number one at the top of beginning to do some egg laying. If they're able to maintain a sufficiently large size cluster with the requisite heated area of somewhere in the 90s temperature-wise Fahrenheit, the queen will then lay eggs. The eggs will then develop into the larva. The larva will be fed. Not very efficiently at first because most of the bees are older age bees, but eventually some of those will emerge. We'll get bees of the proper nurse age, and then they'll expand. So expansion may occur up until the first day of spring, but it depends a little bit on the natural resource. The natural resource in this case being pollen. Yes, they store pollen as bee bread, but they also need pollen to kick off and start this system in earnest. So often for most of us, depending on elevation and variation in the season, our year with our bee colonies will start around that time in March, around that time of the first day of spring. We might do a very little bit of management in the meantime, but know that the bees are already starting their season and are doing their season well before we are able to necessarily get in and do any management that we might have. So that's the buildup. They start early. What we're going to do in our earliest spring management is determine which counties are weak, which ones are stronger, which ones are doing pretty well, and we'll adjust our management. If we have more than one county, we'll adjust our management accordingly, trying to maybe strengthen the weaker counties, and in some cases, this past year in particular, trying to weaken the stronger counties. So this is the buildup period. Initially starting very slow. Initially, there's a big imbalance in terms of the age structure of a bee colony. But with pollen coming in, that is quickly changed and corrected, and then we start getting a more balanced bee population. Soon, however, those colonies that have started that process with an additional imbalance in the age, mostly the older bees dying, and a larger population of the middle-aged bees, we get into a process where the area where they're trying to do everything becomes too compact, too congested, what we call congestion. And then the colonies will perhaps move into another phase in their spring buildup, and that is to prepare to divide the colony. When that queen lays eggs, she's populating her family. She's adding more daughters and the drone sons to that family. But to divide a colony, the process we call swarming, then you get division of the whole colony. That occurs at this time, by this time in mid-spring, or early to mid-spring, depending on seasons, of course, and the availability of that pollen early on. But a vast majority of the colonies will go ahead and do that division. And this then calls our skills into question as to whether we're going to be able to maintain that colony as a building up colony, maintain it as a single unit, so that we might then be able to have a greater deal of success towards the end of this period, as we get towards the longest day of the year in the end of June, the summer solstice, of being able to add additional boxes, providing additional room, not necessarily just for colony buildup, but also to assist the bees with that storage of nectar and its ripening into honey. And so we're going to add boxes, or the process that we call super or supering there in 4. The remainder of the year, the colony, of course, is going to, after the summer solstice, will start its decline on into the fall month. They will then attempt to continue to consolidate their stores, and hopefully there's continuation of flowers that they can visit in preparation, so that by the end of our fall days with our cool nights, as shown at number 7, the bees will then consolidate where they want to continue rearing brood, now at a reduced amount, and then have honey stored above that as their fuel to go through the winter. So that's sort of our seasonal management. It varies a great deal among different families, different seasons. So there are a number of variables. If you have 5 colonies, you basically have 5 families that may be reacting somewhat differently to all of those cues, and signals that they're receiving, so that all 5 colonies won't necessarily be managed exactly the same way. Now, if you have lots of colonies, you're going to kind of insist that the bees all in those boxes all kind of be at the same stage. You're going to do a lot of attempting to have colonies that are all the same, so you can do your management all the same. But for us in the backyard, the 5 colonies can be 5 different aspects in terms of the season for that colony, and in terms of how we might approach them with our management. Okay. So managing bees is managing their population. Right now, this is the blue line that's on the graph here. No matter where we keep bees, whatever continent, the season for most places is basically a bell-shaped curve. So as you look at that, that sort of resembles a bell. Where the arrow right now is they're on their population increase. How far they are on that increase from the lowest point in the overwintering period would depend in terms of your elevation, your temperature, the bee's exposure to the elements, what kind of hive you have, for example, that you're keeping your bees in, and more particularly, the availability of pollen, because that's the driver for that development in the spring, and the ability of bees to get out to collect that pollen. It has to have the 2 components, of course, to have that colony build up. Now, that colony then initially has an imbalance. There's mostly older age bees. And so the development of baby bees, the rearing, is not initially too pronounced because of that imbalance. You don't have the nurse age bees, but eventually they catch up, and then we'll get a couple of pretty full development cycles. All right, until we get to a point where we've got colonies that are at a point where they are then ready to do this division. Many of our colonies will go to this point and will at least go through the motions of making attempts to go ahead through colony division. As beekeepers, of course, we may well intervene at that point and attempt to do some management to halt swarming or reduce the amount of swarming. But that's a normal progression for most of the colonies. If we're after product, if we're after to maximize the storage of the product of honey, we want to keep those bees together. So at population peak, that is not 2 colonies of 30,000 bees, because the colonies divide, but rather 1 colony in the area of 50 to 60,000 worker bees. That colony will then be able to exploit and store more surplus than 2 colonies, same population, but the population split in 2 families because the colonies divided by the process of swarming, 30,000 colonies of 30,000 bees each. Okay, and of course that process is what we know as swarming. The preparation is about over a 2.5-week period of time. Bees know that what's going on in their own colony. The workers, and in their interaction with the queen, are preparing to do this leaving or the swarming from the colony. The earlier we are able to intervene, the better our chances might be of stopping it. If we are very late in that particular process, then even our tried and true methods of reducing the amount of swarming may not be effective. That's simply because all of the bees have been going through all this preparation, and if we are arriving at the door of this at a very late stage, they're going to leave anyway. They're still going to go through the swarming. Because they've been preparing for a couple of weeks to do this very same behavior. Don't try this at home. Here's our beekeeper on the high end of a double extension ladder. got a box of bees, he's going to shake that limb, and all of a sudden that box is going to get very heavy and drop the box and hopefully knock himself off of the ladder coming down. And of course, the two helpers down there in the bottom with all the bees raining down out of the sky, they're soon going to be very scarce. They're going to run away pretty quickly. Swarming, we can accomplish the same outcome, in other words, a division of a colony, but we can do it so that most of the bees stay in the original colony, and we then provide space, extra room for the bees to reduce that tendency, that preparations of leaving and going to the higher tree. Okay, so most of us keep bees in 2 boxes. Some of us keep them in 10 frame boxes on left or 8 frame boxes. Most of us keep them in a movable frame type of box. Traditionally, this is a wooden box. Plastics are replacing the wooden block boxes. Of course, our entrance is at the bottom and we have covers at the top. So in May, our objectives should be that we get those boxes, whatever the domicile we're keeping our bees in, we get those boxes pretty much full of bees. So they have to go through a couple pretty serious brood cycles to increase that population from the overwintering low to be able to fill most of the frames in those 2 boxes. Now, if we let the bees do that whole process, then the bees are keeping us. We're not keeping our honeybees. And they will then often get into that mode of trying to divide. So what we may have been doing with our management is trying to ensure that virtually all the frames are being used in one way or the other to rear brood in these 2 boxes. Because with our European bees, for a normal expansion, to get to that normal large population size, they're going to need that much space, and a good prolific queen can lay the eggs that can occupy that space. But of course, what they're also doing is they are also storing bee bread. They're converting the pollen into bee bread. They are also making some cells that are drone cells, and they also have cells that have honey in it. So to get our bees to fully expand, we've really got to manage those 2 boxes so that the bees, in fact, are using most of the space in the 2 boxes. This is a bit of a management challenge in that if we try to do that expansion before the season allows it, nighttime temperatures primarily, we can spread the brood out, and not having enough adult bees to cover, we can effectively hold our colonies back by not allowing them to raise brood at that 90 degrees plus temperature and killing the brood as it's developing. But we do need to particularly look at the frames of support, the frames of honey and the frames that have bee bread. And our objective should be by May that the bees are in both of the boxes. They're using the vast majority. What started out in January is a cluster perhaps the size of a softball or a soccer ball. At this stage ought to be a cluster on our cooler nights, a cluster that is beach ball size. It's a sphere. And so they're going to expand, the queen is going to ever expand that sphere outward. And if there's something in the way, such as a frame, full frame, it's a good pollen year, a very good early spring pollen year, that gets stored and gets in the way. Or if it was a very good fall last fall and the bees had a lot of honey in there, in a mild winter, the bees have not eaten the honey. And so we have a situation where there's honey in the way. So our management is not only to determine which colonies are weaker and stronger and try to equalize those sort of to something in the middle, but also to ensure that all of those colonies have the ability to continue to expand during spring. And as I said, that's not going to happen by happenstance. We have to do our management so that by May, we have our bees pretty much on virtually some brood on virtually all the frames. In the 10 frame box, yeah, maybe the outer frames in the top box are mostly honey or a very small hatch of brood. The 8 frame is a little bit more challenging, having a little bit less ability to have full frames of honey that are stored on the outside. How can we achieve that? Well, we put in empty frames. That middle-aged bees that I were talking about, they want to build comb. So substituting, taking out fully drawn comb and putting in brand new frames of foundation. Taking out the frames that have a lot of drone size cells, replacing them with foundation, new frames with foundation, or drawn combs from dead outs that need to be cleaned up and the cells polished for the queen to lay eggs. So basically trying to get our colonies to expand to a brood area in those 2 boxes. So initially getting the colonies to build up. Our second aspect of spring is then keeping them together. And finally, to our topic tonight, the third is then that aspect of the supering, adding supers above the brood area. Now, if you keep bees in a horizontal hive, this is a bit more of a challenge. It certainly can be done, however. If you manage bees in one box, in other words, brood in one box, you can still do the same thing, but you're in your colonies and you're taking stuff out of them much more frequently if you're managing bees in one box versus 2 boxes. But some springs, there's a lot of pollen that gets in the way of the colony expanding. There may be a lot of honey left over that gets in the way of the colony expanding, and using the comb space for brood instead having it being filled with bee bread and honey. And then that will lead to the congestion, the middle-aged bees get in the way. And then the queen chemicals do not get efficiently distributed. That then leads to the behavior of that colony division. So our last aspect in terms of supering, let's go the right direction, Dewey. All right, our aspect of supering is to then add boxes to fully expanded brood areas in the lower 2 boxes. And partly this is a couple of management aspects is once we put supers on colonies, to continue our inspection in a brood area, we have to take the supers off. So that's more work, more time in a colony. The colony open for a longer period of time. So that means you're going to drop the temperature, affect the bees. And so with our aspect of supering, it is part and part of that management of the colony. We should be putting supers on fully expanded brood areas. Most cases, initially, we would like to not have the bees store any incoming nectar in cells that the queen could potentially lay eggs in. Some springs, we do have not only a lot of pollen coming in to convert to bee bread, but also some nectar from some of our earlier plant sources. So putting the super on as a valve, as a way for the bees to not put the ripening nectar in cells in the brood area, but in other cells, the cells of the super. To avoid the bees expanding into those boxes, those supers we're putting on, usually then we can use a queen excluder. Now, once bees have begun putting honey and it's beginning to be ripened in that super, some beekeepers will then remove the queen excluder. There is a lore among beekeepers that the queen excluder can be a honey excluder. Bees with fuller stomachs will have a little bit more of a struggle getting through the wires, the stamps of the zinc queen excluders, getting through there and getting into the super, the empty space in the above boxes. So some people will initially put a queen excluder on, but then remove it. in terms of having a better passage of bees from their combs from one box into another box, et cetera, et cetera. Individuals will often put a queen excluder on early as that valve, letting the bees have a place to store that nectar, but also because in some seasons, those early nectar sources can actually provide a surplus extra that can be harvested. And in some areas, there are some plants that are actually those early sources of nectar that provide a different varietal, a different taste and texture and look and feel to honey that would be desirable for your processing, for your own use or for your sales, whatever might be the case. So a super can be part of the management to help ensure that the bees are really utilizing those two boxes down below. They can also then be that early source to collect early sources that you might then potentially be able to harvest. Whether you use a queen excluder, you believe in them, or you think they are interfering with movement of the bees in the colony, there's no evidence, no real evidence one way or the other. You're going to feel one way or the other about them and about whether you want to use them or whether you do not want to try to use the excluders. They are useful if you are in the habit of adding a super early. There's nothing wrong with bees expanding into a third box. The issue becomes then if you want to extract honey from that box and bees have reared brood in it, ripening honey stored in brood cells will darken faster. And also, when you take the supers off to harvest the honey, comb that has had brood reared in it is then attractive to pests such as wax moth, and you can't handle the frames the same way in storage that you could handle frames that have only had honey stored in them and not had brood reared in them. So there are kind of some management decisions that are made here, rather to how soon you might put a super on, and of course that particular season, and whether you are in an area that has one of those early nectar flows, not a pollen flow, but an early nectar flow that the bees can take advantage of. So all those kind of enter in the decision. One other decision that, of course, is going to enter into that is I'm talking about doing the production of extracted honey, the liquid honey. If you're producing honey in the comb and you're going to harvest the honey in the comb for your own use, for your market, whatever might be the case, you're probably going to avoid those early supers because the effort to get good marketable honey in the comb is an art into itself in terms of supering. But in most cases, the supers go on at the beginning of a particular flow, and as soon as the flow is over and the cells are mostly ripened, those combs come off the colony. Unlike extracted honey, this first super on may be on for a couple of months on the colony, or until you do all of your super removal at whatever time of the year you do this, in July or August of the year. So honey in a comb the supers would be handled a bit different, and particularly also that first super on. So we have our base colonies here. Base colonies for our Oregon bees are two standard boxes, 10 frames. We have a few 8 frames, but mostly 10 frames. And then the colony on the right has a single super. The one on the left has 2 supers. One of the other concepts in terms of supering, if you're going to the work to put a super on, except perhaps for that very first super, why not put 2 on? And what it is the aspect of challenging our bees. Various studies we've looked at that. If you put more empty comb space on the colony, everything else being equal, they will store more potential harvestable honey when you have more comb space. than if you have only the one box on. So again, if that is one of your objectives in keeping bees, to try to have honey, think of perhaps not one super, but two supers. The other way, of course, of achieving that is to put initial super on, watch it, monitor it, and then as the bees begin to work in the first super, then challenge them with a second super. And just as we're trying to get the bees to use virtually every frame in the two boxes below, we want to try to have them do that in the supers. So that supering is never a one and done. In other words, you go to the colony, they're pretty full in the boxes below, so you add a box, you're done. No, you're not. It's not a one and done. So that means moving frames about, or again, adding a second box to the colony. Now there are different ways of trying to do this. After you put that initial super on, for example, the colony on the right, you then can top super by adding another super on top of it. Or to add a second super, you take that first super off, the green one on the right, put it aside, go from your storage, put your new super on, and then replace the green super as now the second super up on top, as you see in the configuration on the left. So the white super being added after the first initial green super has been put on the colony, but put at the bottom of the supers directly on top of the brood area. So bottom supering, top supering versus bottom supering. And one other method of adding that second box or adding a super at any time is to let the bees know what you're doing. So when we go to bee colony, we look at the brood area, we look at our frames, it's a communication between us and the bees. We're trying to learn what they're trying to say about their development, about their space needs, about what's going on in the colony. And when we do something to them, like move a frame around or add a super, we're trying to tell them what our expectation is. So we're trying to communicate to them that this is for storage of nectar, different from brood, for example. It's a communication, a two-way communication. So one of the ways we can communicate with our supering is ensure that the bees know that they have another story on their house, that their house has been expanded in size. And so taking a frame from storage and putting it in the middle of that green super, on the first super we add to the left, to the right, tells the bees that is what our expectation is, that those frames in that box, that green box, would be used for storage of nectar and then ripened into honey. And when we add the second super, that one, the white box, we would then, provided the supers are the same size, we would remove a frame that the bees were working on in the initial box, the green box, and interchange it with at least one frame in the new box that we've added on, whether we put that box on top or we put it on the bottom. In other words, we're telling our bees, communicating to our bees in terms of they now have this space available, and our expectation is to fill it up, please. We're expecting to have some honey harvest. So our communication back to what our bees might be. It's not one and done, okay? And with supering, of course, the devil is always in that detail. So do we add more boxes simply at the top? A lot easier to do, just pull the covers off and add them. Or do we put it at the bottom? Or do we tell the bees what we hope that they will do by trying to bait the supers by putting frames that have already been worked, drawn comb or comb with honey, or bees that are storing nectar in a frame, interchanging the frames. And after the boxes are on, then do we add more boxes, or do we attempt to have them expand from and use all 8 or 10 frames? So is it one or more boxes that we add, or do we also then move the frames in those boxes? So after we put that first super on, they're likely to be working on the frames that are in the middle. So not accepting the one and done, do we go back in and then move the frames and spread it out. Now, this is later in the year, so there's less issue with their clustering on winter, colder nights during the early spring. But secondly, since this is combs that we expect honey to be in, it does not need to be kept at that 90 degrees. And so we can rather freely move frames about. So if we want to have them utilize all 8 or 10 frames in that box, we may need to move the frames themselves, not just between boxes, but from middle frames moved outward, frames that they're not working on the outside move back towards the middle. Of course, and then we can put on different supers for different reasons. So on this particular beekeeper with the multiple pallets as a hive stand here, they have a box that they expect the bees to store honey in the comb. That would be the handholds that are more of the slotted handholds, the first white box. That's a shallower box, and that's for special other frames using a thin foundation, a thin surplus foundation that we want the bees to store honey in the comb. And then the boxes above that, then drawn comb that we would then expect to do extracted honey. So what kind of honey we are hoping to harvest, whether it's honey that is in the comb of some sort in boxes or around cabana squares that we put in, or if we're going to cut that comb out into pieces or in sections, cut comb honey, or we want to put the two together as a chunk honey. I think that I have that on the next slide. So all of that is to illustrate that with supering, often we get 3 supers on this colony. We're not going to dig down. Actually, there's 4 supers on the colony. We're not going to dig down in that colony to get back to the brood area. We're going to once we have the supers on, generally we're going to try to manage the supers. If we have to dig down to the brood area for any reason, all of those have to come off. That's going to delay, make a longer inspection time, etc. Actually looking at the colony and thinking of the management of this particular beekeeper. So the green boxes, the green and the red stripe or star boxes, that's all meant for brood. So this beekeeper had a strong colony and expanded the brood area, not just in 2 boxes, but added a 3rd box for brood area. So a fully expanded brood area. And then there are 3 supers that are on top of it in this particular management system. There are some that kind of cringe when they see this. One, if those boxes stacked on top are full or are filling with nectar, that means you are going to have to lift them off, very heavy boxes. But the other aspect is that this may not always be compatible with bees of storing this much surplus. And of course, a number of things can go wrong. You get a heavy rains, the soil gets saturated and soft, and the boxes can tip over. They can fall over, vandalism, knocking them over, any number of different things. With my Africanized bees, so I go part of the year to Bolivia, and the family keeps Africanized bees there. They don't do this type of storage. Africanized bees are not good honey storers. They're great brood rearers. And so what we do is we basically harvest the outside frames. We don't usually use super and continue supering. So it depends a great deal in terms of making sure those boxes are fully developed with brood. And then having boxes on top of that as well of all those supers. Think of expensive beekeeping when you start thinking of having this many boxes and this many frames. And at one time, of course, we didn't buy fully assembled frames with foundation, and we had to put all those together You can imagine the winter time spent in the garage or the workshop trying to put all those boxes together for this type of a harvest. On the other hand, it's, that's going to be a pretty good harvest if most of those boxes are full or partially full. One other point to make with doing this, if you're simply adding boxes, the bees may in fact stay in the middle of the boxes. So although the boxes have 8 or 10 frames, the active combs that they are using might only be the 3 or 4 or 5 middle frames, with outer frames not at all being utilized. And you put another box on and the same thing happens in that next box. You put another box on and the same thing happens in that next box. So you've got a lot of equipment on there, a lot of frames that you've assembled, but the bees aren't using all of them. So we can apply the same principle in terms of getting the bees to expand in the bottom box as we can in terms of our supering and adding super boxes as well. Supering, like inspecting brood and for development of the tendency for swarming, is never ever a one and done. Okay. So then we're going to need to remove the bees, remove them from the supers at some point. So we have several techniques. Traditional has been bounce and brush. Bounce the frames on the top bar, the strongest part of the frame, not on the bottom, but on the top bar. And then they use the hated bee brush, hated by bees, and just gets an awful mess. And bees really don't like that brush. But then after you bounce the bees off, by shaking them off or bouncing the top bars, brushing the remainders off, or by the use of a bee escape, where we're actually taking advantage of those inner covers that have the oval hole. This is one of the original ones developed. We have many modified ways to do it to clear the bees, and these are basically a one-way passage. So without making a mess in the supers, you put this escape below the supers that you want to harvest, and then the bees go on down, but then cannot come back in. And the reason they would go back down is because it gets cold at night and they want to go join their sisters down below where it is warmer. So this works best when you have cool nights, colder nights, and the bees go down. And it works best if there's only one or a couple of supers on. For 4 or 5 supers on a colony, the bee escape just is not very efficient for getting the bees to exit. And you have to do that to ensure that no bees are able to get back into those boxes, or you'll find that other bees will rob out the supers on which you're making bees exit from, and you'll lose your harvest to all those robbing bees. A third method is using repellent chemicals. There are a couple available on the market. So at the top of the colony, we replace our covers with a fume board. We place a small amount of the repellent chemical on the fume board and let the sun then beat down on that, volatilize the chemical, and the bees go away from it. They're repelled by the smell. That's closed at the top, so where they go down below. On a bright, sunny day, what you might do as a management is get them to remove themselves from one box, take that box off, and then move the fume board down and do it with the subsequent boxes until you get back down to the brood area. It's more difficult if you've got 3 or 4 boxes and you put the fume board on one time. Again, not a one and done. Put it on one time and expect them to go all the way down through 3 supers back down to the brood area. The other thing is that many of these chemicals have a lasting effect, have a lasting smell. So you don't want to spill them, don't want to get droplets of it on your clothing, etc. And some people claim that honey that's not fully ripened can pull up some of these odors of these repellents. It's a matter of how much time you have the fume board, the repellent on top of the colony. Or use forced air. So here we're from the bottom of the colony. with a leaf blower, nothing more than a leaf blower with a nozzle at the end. We're blowing the bees back out. This would put an awful lot of bees everywhere, all around in the air. But you've created with the noise, the confusion, and blowing them just off out of the boxes, such a confusing situation that this really doesn't lead to more stings because the bees, you've just got them so thoroughly confused. It does move out to bees moving about in colonies a great deal. So whenever you're doing anything as gross as this with your management, then hopefully you don't have colonies that have any disease or apiary situations where the disease is present, because that's going to be a good way to make sure everyone has the same condition. So then we collect the supers. If you have a few colonies or a lot of colonies, you bring the supers back to some central place. And of course, then for extracting, you're going to need some special equipment. For most of us, the illustration on the left shows what you need. You need an extractor. This one is a motorized one, so you don't need the rest of the family to turn the handle for you. You need a collecting bin or two. You need a couple strainers. You need an uncapping knife. You need a red checkered cloth to put down on the floor because there's going to be honey kind of everywhere. To relax you while you're doing all this, you need music. So that's our music stand. And then after it's all over, you're going to need to relax. So you've got to have a relaxing chair. That's all part of your situation. And when you're not doing it, it all just kind of folds up into one part of the basement or a quarter of your activities room or a quarter of your garage, wherever it might be. Extractors, there are various prices, various ranges for various sizes of frames. And basically what you do is you uncap the wax covering and then you sling the honey out. So by centrifugal motion, the honey is then slung out of the cells. Extractors that do this from both sides of the frame, the radial extractor shown on the right, are faster and simpler to use than where you can only remove it from one side because there's a central midrib of the comb, or a tangential extractor. You have to physically change the position. And of course, on a large scale, that's all combined. So at the top here, the beekeeper on the left has put a frame in the uncapping device, and then something flails away at the comb, cuts off the comb. And so the frame then passes down and then onto a conveyor belt, then passes out. And then off to the right of the lady there with the sweater, there's going to be then at the end of that chain, at the end of that tub, there's going to be an individual picking up the frames and putting them into the extractor. And this operation can go very fast. So in this case, usually there's going to be a minimum of 2 extractors, or sometimes 3 extractors. And these may run for as much as a month as you start increasing the number of colonies that you might have. It is always a bit of a chore to do all this activity, and I always look forward to starting it, but then I seem like I look more forward to getting it finished at any one year after it gets started. So we can use the liquid honey, the extracted or the liquid honey. We can do section or comb honey or cut comb honey. So in front of the jar of extracted honey, that's a piece of comb that's been cut. Now for sales, you're going to want to have nice, neat cuts, neat corners, neat pieces of the size to fit the container. But for your own table, your own use, that can be bits and pieces of corners and cuts and whatever it might be. To have a usable comb, honey in the comb, you do not start with the thicker honey foundation, beeswax foundation. You would start with what we call thin surplus, a very thin sheet of that foundation, so that when you get as you're chewing this and you get to that center midrib, you don't have a whole big slug of beeswax sitting there. It's as thin as the comb cells themselves. We can take the liquid honey, filter it, seed it with already creamed honey or crystallized honey, and then by sitting it at 65 degrees, produce more product of creamed honey. So this is the honey that is not, that has been liquefied, but then again solidified to a very creamy butter-like consistency. And that all comes with close attention to the detail of doing all of this, making sure you have the honey well filtered so that the crystals form very small and you don't get a gritty, sandy type texture to your product. And then you can use honey, of course, in all kinds of products. So where I go in South America with our bees there, we sell very little honey as such per se. Most of the honey we sell that people are going to eat is honey in the comb, because that is true bee honey, authentic, because it's in the original container as the bees have stored it. But mostly our liquid honey is to help the medicine go down. So the liquid honey is used to dissolve, to contain the propolis, to contain the pollen, to contain the royal jelly, helping the medicine go down. But we can put it in any number of other candies, products that we will put on our bodies, our soaps, our shampoos, creams, for example. Things that will stay liquid. We can substitute honey as a sugar substitute for anything, almost anything in our kitchen. It's of course a benefit in our bakery products, because the honey that we put in there, rather than the sucrose sugar, that honey will absorb moisture from the air, so your bakery products will stay fresher for a longer period of time because it's absorbing moisture from the air, because you substituted sugar for honey. And in many cases, you have to, might adjust your overall liquid measurements of other liquids that might go in the recipe, reduce other liquids in the amount. And you need to be careful, because many of the honeys have a greater sweetening power. So if you want to have a certain level of sweetness in the final bakery product, your final bread or something, you might not put the amount of sugar that you would if you're using cane sugar, beet sugar, granulated sugar. As I said, most of the world uses honey as medicines. Okay. How are you going to get rid of it? That will depend on in any one year how much you produce, and it's going to vary, and how many colonies you have, and whether you have outlets. Outlets can be as simple as a honey sale cart. Holiday shows are great events because you spend less time selling to the public. You have a public that wants to come to those particular shows to buy products at that time. So holiday shows often coinciding with our fall harvest festival shows of one sort or another, holiday shows for the fall holidays of whatever religion it might be. All of those are good outlets. Of course, if you have honey in different size containers, you have different types of honeys. Rather than just selling in one size container, you'll sell more product if you have it in different sizes and different shapes, different colors, for example. And of course, with many of the sales, if it's possible to give people a free taste of your product, you'll enjoy the sale as well. And of course, then there's all those other events that might apply. Popular for favors for anniversaries, of course, weddings, very appropriate as gifts for the honeymoon. So it's sort of the sky's the limit in terms of different ways to try to get rid of the product. And of course, the modern way of all of this is advertising, setting up a web page, setting up your attractive label, and then selling it over the and mailing it you know, so you don't have to have a brick and mortar. You don't have to be in some place. You just take the orders in and send them off. Okay. You can do anything with the honey. You have to be a little careful with some things, but you can add anything to honey to produce something different. A varietal honey, for example, natural honey. Uh, there are a lot of varieties are sold where the bees actually don't produce any surplus honey that you can market. So you'll see pumpkin honey, you'll see watermelon honey, because the beekeeper put bees in pollination in those sites. They don't get necessarily they're going to get any honey from it, but that is a justification for taking some of your honey and calling it pumpkin honey, watermelon honey, whatever might be the case, or at least the sellers will feel it's justification. Here in Oregon, where it's legal, putting your CBD in that honey, whether it's the straws or the actual honey itself, virtually anything. As I say, if you're adding something that's got a lot of moisture to it, you've got to be careful, because that's going to elevate the eventual moisture. If you sell it quickly and it moves quickly, that's not a factor. But if you're going to try to add a fruit, generally you need to go to freeze-dried fruits where the moisture has been extracted, or a large amount of moisture has been extracted already. You put fresh strawberries in there, it may be delicious, but it's also going to elevate the moisture content, and you may then get fermentation setting up in that honey pretty quickly. Again, not necessarily a lot of imagination. I can buy honey out of the back of the bicycle. Here our cellar and a market in Bolivia, and there I am on the right buying honey in a cheap old plastic container. And to show that he's authentic, he does also have honey in the comb, so that's not a cheap sugar syrup. Unfortunately, as in the United States, most of the honey comes from somewhere else. So there's a lot of contraband honey in Bolivia that comes in from Argentina, for example, and a lot of adulterated honey. In the United States, 3/4 of the honeys that our consumers are using comes from somewhere else, doesn't come from U.S. producers. So trying to get rid of the product. If you don't have an outlet, I will tell you, it takes an awful long time, because honey is so viscous. It's going to take a long time, a lot of hot water to try to run it down the drain to get rid of it at the end of the year. So you have some empty combs to give your bees the next year. The honey stick people have come up with this concept of infusing the honey with some sort of a flavor, colors and flavors. You could put it in all kinds of different products as the replacing of the sugar, or making the sugar around it. So there are honey candies that have honey as the core, or honeys that are various types of candy products that have the honey as the sweetener rather than the sugar itself. There are have been over time other uses. Of course, much of the world, it is a medicine, or it's the vehicle for medicine. Directly as medicine, sore throats. It's burn relief, for example, cut relief. You'll get cuts to close up and have less scarring if you use honey, because of those various properties of the honey. For example, burns, again the same way. Allergy relief, even though you may be allergic to something else, there's the widespread feeling that if you take honey for allergies that you might have, particularly plant allergies, your allergy will be less, and it's all in the beliefs of the receiver in many cases with that. It is antiseptic, antibacterial, and so in internally, externally, animals, ourselves, has many uses. Ingredients in a number of things, lotions, potions, gums, etc. Processing of cigarettes. One time his center was center for golf balls, embalming fluid. And then it is also something to burn off sugars, because it's immediately absorbed into the blood. So it's often been touted as to counter effects of alcohol in your bloodstream. Diabetics will sometimes substitute honey for any sugars because they can take a smaller amount of it and get the same sweetening power. You still need to monitor your sugars. You're still taking in a great amount of sugar, so you can't just simply have the belief that by using honey you can use as much as you want. You have to watch your intake, but you can use less and get your same sweetening power. There's a number of other products. All right, so some aspects of looking at honey and some products with honey. I hope this has been of some use, some information, some new things that maybe you did not realize. And for some of you newbies, some of the marvels of this amazing product that our bees produce for us.